One night. $1 billion deal. One impossible condition. When the Russo syndicate's untouchable boss needed a wife to survive a negotiation that could make or break his empire, every woman he tried to buy for the role fell apart under the weight of the lie. Then the maid who'd spent years reading liars for a living decided the lie needed rewriting. And so did he. Damien Russo stood at the center of his Long Island estate's grand foyer, staring at a problem that no amount of money or muscle could solve. At 6'3" with slicked-back black hair, a trimmed beard, and a tattoo climbing the side of his neck from beneath the collar of a cream Italian three-piece suit, he looked like a man who had never once been told no. He was the undisputed head of the Russo Syndicate, an empire built on marble floors, private guards, and silence that came at whatever price he named. But silence wasn't going to save him this time. In 24 hours, Alessandro Vitale would walk through those same doors, the last true kingmaker of the Sicilian old guard, a man who controlled shipping routes worth more than the rest of Damien's empire combined. Vitale had one unbreakable rule, and it had nothing to do with money. He refused to do business with unmarried men. To Vitale, a bachelor was a man without roots, without loyalty, without a future worth investing in. A single respected wife at Damien's side wasn't a preference. It was the price of admission. Damien needed a wife by morning, not for a lifetime, for one night. His right-hand man, Victor Leone, had spent 3 days failing to find her. A parade of actresses, socialites, and models had come and gone through the estate, each one more polished than the last, and each one had cracked under the weight of what was actually being asked of her. One had flirted so aggressively, she'd nearly blown the entire cover story before she'd even met Vitale. Another had gone pale and silent the moment Damien walked into a room, unable to hold a conversation without her hands shaking. The last candidate, a statuesque heiress named Vivienne, dressed in a gown that cost more than most people's cars, had just fled through the front doors in tears after catching her hem on a display case, sobbing that she hadn't agreed to marry a monster, not even for one night. "That's 4 this week, boss," Victor said, dragging a hand down his face. His tie was already loosened, his composure fraying at the edges. "I can make more calls. There's a woman in the city who does corporate arrangements, very discreet. No more calls." Damien's voice was low, controlled, the kind of quiet that made the air in the room feel heavier. Vitale isn't a fool. He spent 40 years reading liars for a living. He'll see through some 22-year-old who thinks this is a modeling job in 5 minutes. He turned toward the window, his jaw tight. "I don't need beauty. I need someone who looks like she'd still be standing if I died tomorrow." The doors to the East Wing opened before Victor could respond. Rosie Carter walked in with an armful of fresh linens, unbothered by the tension thickening the room around her. She'd worked in this house long enough to recognize a crisis the moment she stepped into one, usually right before somebody asked her to clean up whatever mess it left behind. She set the linens down on a side table and glanced between the two men. "Maybe the problem isn't the women," she said. The room went still. Victor's eyes went wide with something close to panic. Damien turned, slow and deliberate, the way he moved when something had actually managed to hold his attention. Rosie didn't flinch under the look. She never had. 2 years of moving quietly through a house full of powerful, careless people had taught her exactly how they lied to each other, exactly how they postured, and exactly how thin all of it looked from behind a laundry cart. "You're the maid," Damien said, studying her the way he'd study a contract with a clause he didn't trust. "And you're the man who's made 4 women cry this week trying to hire a fake wife," Rosie said evenly. "I'd say I understand people a lot better than whoever's been sending you these candidates." Damien stepped closer, close enough that she caught the scent of cedar and expensive tobacco clinging to him. Most people in this house found somewhere else to look when he closed distance like that. Rosie lifted her chin instead and held her ground. "You think you know what's wrong with my plan," he said. "It wasn't a question. I know that no real couple stands the way you had that last one standing," Rosie said. "Real couples interrupt each other. They finish each other's sentences badly. They have 100 stupid little habits nobody coaches you on in 20 minutes before a gala. You weren't hiring a wife. You were hiring an actress, and Vitale's going to smell the difference from across the room." Damien said nothing for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing with something that wasn't quite doubt and wasn't quite belief either. "If you think you can do better," he said finally, "prove it." Rosie smiled. "Not nervous, not eager, just certain. Only if you agree to follow my rules." "My rules," Damien repeated, arms crossed. "You're the maid. You clean my floors. You don't set terms." "I did until about 30 seconds ago." Rosie picked the linens back up, unbothered, like she hadn't just reorganized the entire negotiation. "You need me more than I need this job. That changes things." Victor made a small, strangled sound and suddenly found something urgent to check on his phone. Damien studied her for a long moment, then named a figure, enough money to buy the house she rented, and the 3 next to it. Rosie didn't blink. No, I'm not doing this for a payout, Mr. Russo. If I'm doing it because it's interesting, and because somebody in this house should finally do it right. She set the linens down again, this time like she meant to stay a while. "So here's what I want instead. You're honest with me about the danger, about what's actually happening at this gala. All of it. You respect my time, which means you don't summon me at midnight because you forgot how married people talk. I don't change how I look. Not the dress size, not the makeup, none of it. If your wife is supposed to be believable, she has to look like someone who actually exists. And when this is over, I walk away. No strings, no favors owed, no next assignment." Damien considered her the way he considered enemies, carefully, for longer than was comfortable. "That's all? That's all. Fine." He extended a hand. Rosie shook it like she was closing a business deal, because she was. She started that same afternoon, and within an hour, it was clear she hadn't been exaggerating about doing it right. She sat him down at the long dining table with a legal pad and started asking questions no one had bothered to ask him in years. "How did we meet?" "I don't know. You catered an event." "Wrong. Boring, and Vitaly will ask follow-up questions." She tapped the pad. "We met because I fixed something you'd broken. You're arrogant enough that it has to start with you being wrong about something. Say, you spilled wine on my dress at a charity gala, and instead of apologizing, you argue that the dress looked better ruined." Damien almost smiled. "Almost. That's insulting. That's memorable. Which is the point?" She wrote it down. "First date. You took me somewhere you thought would impress me and it backfired. Some absurdly expensive restaurant. I hated it. We ended up getting food from a cart outside instead. I don't eat from carts. You do now." She didn't look up. "Proposal. On the balcony of this house. No big production. Because you're not a big production person. You're a control person. And control people propose quietly so nothing can go wrong. Honeymoon. Amalfi Coast. You got sunburned because you refused to reapply sunscreen, and I never let you live it down. Favorite restaurant. A little Sicilian place in Brooklyn because it makes you homesick for a version of Italy you've never actually lived in." By the time she finished, Damien was staring at her with something between suspicion and reluctant respect. "You built an entire marriage in 40 minutes. I built a believable one. There's a difference. Now stand up." "Why?" "Because Vitaly is going to watch how you touch me before he watches anything else you say." She held out her hand. "Hold it. Not like you're arresting me, like it's normal." He took her hand. It was, predictably, stiff and mechanical, his grip too firm, his posture too formal. "You're holding my hand like it's a hostage negotiation. I'm holding it correctly. You're holding it like you've never held anyone's hand who wasn't trying to get something from you." She adjusted his fingers, ignoring the way his jaw tightened at the correction. "Relax your shoulders. Nobody who's actually married stands like they're about to be assassinated. Given the circumstances, that's an occupational hazard." That, unexpectedly, got a huff of air out of him that was almost a laugh. "There," she said, satisfied. "Do that again, except let it actually reach your face." They spent the rest of the afternoon on it, Rosie feeding him fake memories until he stopped stumbling over them, correcting his laugh until it stopped sounding like a warning shot, teaching him to finish her sentences by deliberately leaving them unfinished until he learned to fill the silence instead of letting it sit there like a loaded gun. He argued with nearly everything she told him to do, and she argued back without an ounce of the fear that had sent 4 other women running from this house. And somewhere in the middle of one particularly ridiculous fight about whether he'd ever willingly eaten from a food cart in his life, Damien Rousseau laughed, a real one, short and surprised, like it had escaped before he could stop it. He didn't remember the last time that had happened. By evening, the final piece arrived, a garment bag from the estate's tailor, delivered per Rosie's very specific instructions. She disappeared to change, and when she stepped back into the foyer 20 minutes later, Damien forgot, briefly, how to speak. The blush-pink gown moved like water around her, lace climbing her arms. Her dark hair swept into an elegant twist. Her chin lifted with the same unshaken confidence she'd walked in with the first day, carrying laundry like she owned the room. He wasn't speechless because she'd suddenly become beautiful. He was speechless because she'd been standing in front of him the whole time, and he was only now seeing it. The Rousseau Palace ballroom glittered like something built to intimidate rather than welcome. Chandeliers dripping gold light over marble floors, waiters gliding between clusters of guests in tuxedos and gowns worth more than most people's cars. Damien's black town car pulled beneath the entrance archway just after 8. And when the door opened, Rosie stepped out into a hush that rippled through the crowd gathered near the staircase. She felt it immediate, the whispers. "That's her, the wife. I heard he hired an actress. I didn't expect this." Rosie kept her chin level and her hand steady in the crook of Damien's arm, the blush-pink gown catching the chandelier light as they crossed the foyer. She'd expected the stares. She hadn't expected how loudly some people whispered, as if the size of her body meant she'd also lost her hearing. "They're not being subtle," Damien murmured, his voice low enough for her alone. "They don't have to be. I'm not here to impress the guests." She smiled at a passing couple who quickly looked away. "I'm here for one man, and he hasn't arrived yet." While Damien accepted a drink he wouldn't touch and exchanged clipped pleasantries with men who eyed Rosie like she was a business decision gone wrong, Rosie did what she'd always done best. She watched. 2 guards by the east exit, both favoring their right side, meaning right-handed and likely armed there. A waiter refilling glasses too quickly, skipping tables that weren't important. The catering staff entrance, propped open by a service cart, unattended for exactly the length of time it took someone to walk from the kitchen to the wine cellar and back. She catalogued exits, counted bodyguards, noted which guests kept glancing toward the door like they were expecting someone more important than themselves. She was still counting when the room shifted. Alessandro Vitale entered without fanfare, which was somehow more commanding than if he'd arrived with an entourage. Silver-haired, unhurried, dressed in a charcoal suit with none of the ostentation surrounding him. He moved through the crowd like a man who'd spent decades being the most dangerous person in every room he entered and had long since stopped needing to prove it. His eyes found Rosie before Damien had finished the introduction. "Mr. Vitale." Damien's voice carried the practiced warmth Rosie had spent an entire afternoon coaching into him. "My wife, Rosie." Vitale studied her. Not her dress, not her size, not the things Rosie had braced herself for all evening. He studied her posture, her steady hands, the way she held his gaze instead of dropping it. "Mrs. Rousseau." He took her offered hand, his grip firm, testing. "You're not what I expected." "I get that a lot," Rosie said, "usually. Right before I prove someone wrong." Something flickered behind Vitale's calm expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Walk with me." He didn't wait for Damien. He simply offered his arm, and Rosie took it, aware of Damien's eyes following them across the ballroom with an expression she couldn't quite read. Vitale's questions came quietly, one after another, disguised as small talk to anyone listening, but precise as a blade to anyone who understood what he was really doing. "How did you meet my associate?" "He ruined my dress at a charity gala and had the audacity to argue. It looked better ruined." The lie came out smooth, familiar, exactly as she and Damien had rehearsed it that afternoon. And the proposal? Quiet, on the balcony of the estate. "He's not a man for spectacle when it actually matters." She let a small, genuine-sounding laugh slip out. Though he got terribly sunburned on our honeymoon and refuses to admit it was his own fault for skipping sunscreen, Vitale did laugh at that. A short, surprised sound. He always was too stubborn for his own good. Behind them, Damien watched the exchange with something close to disbelief. She hadn't stumbled once. Not on a single detail they'd invented over sandwiches and legal pads that afternoon. He found himself, unexpectedly, holding his breath. It was near the dessert course when the moment came. A guest, A red-faced man named Carlton Ashford, whose family fortune had thinned considerably faster than his opinions, leaned toward his companion just loud enough to be overheard. "I'll say this for Russo," he said, swirling his champagne. "Bold choice, marrying someone who clearly enjoys his money more than his gym." The table nearest them went quiet. Damien's jaw tightened, his hand moving instinctively toward Rosie's chair. But Rosie only smiled, slow, unbothered, entirely in control. "You know," she said, turning toward Carlton with pleasant precision, "confidence can't be tailored, Mr. Ashford. Unlike that jacket, which I suspect was made for a man 20 pounds lighter and considerably more interesting." The table erupted. Somewhere behind her, Alessandro Vitale let out a booming, genuine laugh that carried across half the ballroom, raising his blast toward Rosie like she'd just won something significant. Carlton's face went the color of the wine he was holding, and he found urgent business elsewhere. Damien said nothing, but Rosie caught it anyway. The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, quickly hidden behind his glass. She'd expected to survive the evening. She hadn't expected to enjoy it. Dinner service began, and Rosie settled into the evening the way she settled into every room she'd ever quietly run, by making it hers without anyone noticing she'd taken it. She held court at the long table beside Vitale, and one by one, the conversations that had started as polite obligation turned into something else entirely. When an older guest mentioned his grandmother's recipe for osso buco, Rosie countered with a story about learning to make her own mother's Sunday sauce, insisting the secret was patience, not ingredients. You couldn't rush what needed 6 hours to become something worth eating. Vitale, it turned out, agreed passionately, and the two of them spent 10 minutes debating simmering times while Damien watched, faintly stunned, as the most feared man in the Sicilian old guard argued tomato sauce with his fake wife like they'd known each other for years. "Family," Vitale said eventually, setting down his fork, "is not something men like us discuss lightly." "No," Rosie agreed. "But it's the only thing worth building anything for. Loyalty without family behind it is just fear wearing a nicer suit." Vitale went quiet at that, studying her the way he might study a business proposal that had surprised him with how sound it was. "Your wife," he said to Damien without looking away from Rosie, "understands things it takes most men in this business 30 years to learn." Damien inclined his head, but the compliment landed somewhere he hadn't expected, not as a business win but as something closer to pride, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd spent the whole night watching Rosie work a room that had written her off the moment she walked in, and somewhere between the wine course and Vitale's laughter, he'd stopped seeing the maid who scrubbed his marble floors. He was watching a woman entirely capable of running his empire beside him, and he wasn't sure when that thought had started feeling less like an observation and more like a want. Rosie, meanwhile, kept talking. Travel tradition, the merits of Sicily over the mainland, an opinion on arranged versus chosen marriage that made Vitale laugh loud enough to turn heads, and underneath every word, she never stopped watching the room the way she'd been watching it since they walked in. That was how she noticed him, a waiter near the east wall, moving between tables with a tray of champagne flutes, unremarkable at first glance. But Rosie had spent 2 years learning the particular choreography of people who worked in houses like this one, and something about him was wrong in ways that accumulated quietly, one small detail at a time. His shoes, polished, formal, but with a thick tactical sole no catering company issued, the kind built for traction and speed, not standing gracefully for 6 hours. His posture, too rigid through the shoulders, weight balanced evenly on both feet, instead of favoring one the way exhausted waiters did by dessert. His tray, held slightly too high, slightly too centered, like a man conscious of its weight rather than someone who'd carried 100 trays a night for years. And his eyes, every other waiter in the room scanned tables, glasses, guests needing refills. His eyes kept finding Damien and staying there a beat too long before moving on. He'd circled the table twice now. He hadn't served a single glass. Rosie kept smiling, kept nodding along to something Vitale was saying about Palermo in the spring, but underneath the table, her hand found Damien's knee, light enough to look affectionate, firm enough to be a signal. Damien glanced at her, and whatever he saw in her face made the practiced warmth in his own expression sharpen into something colder, more alert. "Everything all right, darling?" he asked, voice pitched exactly right for the table, easy and unconcerned. Rosie leaned in close, the way a wife might lean in to whisper something private to a husband, her lips barely moving. "Don't look yet," she murmured. East wall, grey jacket, third waiter from the door. Damien didn't look yet. He reached for his wine instead. Casual, unbothered, years of discipline keeping his face perfectly composed, while every instinct in him went taut. "What am I looking for?" Rosie's fingers tightened just slightly against his knee. "That waiter isn't here to serve dinner." Damien didn't look toward the east wall. He kept his eyes on Vitale, kept his voice light, kept the conversation moving while every muscle in his body coiled tight beneath the surface of his calm. Beside him, Rosie did the same, smiling, nodding, one hand still resting on his knee, her eyes tracking the waiter's every step, without ever seeming to look at him directly. He'd stopped pretending to serve anyone. He was closing the distance to their table in small, patient increments, weaving between guests with the tray held like a shield rather than a service piece. "Security's by the west doors," Rosie murmured, barely a breath of sound. "He's cutting them off from this side of the room. I see him." Damien's jaw was a hard line now. All pretense of ease gone from his eyes even as his mouth stayed relaxed. "On my signal, get under the table." "No." Rosie's voice didn't waver. "You're not the only target he's watching, and I'm not going to be the reason your head's turned the wrong way when it matters." There wasn't time to argue. The waiter set the tray down on a service stand 10 feet away, and his hand moved inside his jacket. Everything slowed. Rosie saw it first. The shift in his stance, weight dropping low, shoulder squaring toward their table with the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with serving dinner. She didn't think. She moved, shoving her chair back and throwing her full weight into Damien, exactly as the crack of a gunshot tore through the ballroom's polite chatter. The bullet meant for Damien's chest caught the edge of his shoulder instead, a burning graze rather than the killing shot it had been aimed to be. And both of them went down hard as the table beside them exploded into shattered crystal and screaming guests. The ballroom dissolved into chaos. Rosie was already moving before Damien had fully processed what had happened. She grabbed the nearest serving tray from an abandoned cart and hurled it sidearm across the room, catching a second gunman, one Damien hadn't even clocked yet, emerging from the kitchen doors with a weapon raised, square across the face. He staggered, and in that half-second of confusion, 2 of Damien's guards closed the distance and took him down. "Down!" Damien's voice cut through the noise like a blade, holding Rosie behind an overturned banquet table as gunfire opened up from multiple directions. His security team had scrambled into position, return fire cracking across the ballroom as guests screamed and fled toward the exits in a stampede of silken panic. There wasn't one shooter. There were 4. Positioned around the room's perimeter, disguised as staff, waiting for exactly this moment to strike at once. Damien pulled a weapon from beneath his jacket, years of discipline taking over as he moved with brutal, economical precision, dropping one attacker near the east exit before the man could reload. Rosie stayed low, dragging an elderly guest to safety behind a marble pillar, her eyes never stopping their sweep of the room even as bullets chipped stone inches from her head. "Vitale!" Damien shouted, scanning for the old man through the smoke and scattering crowd. Behind the bar, "Security's got him," Rosie called back, already moving toward Damien's exposed flank as a third gunman rounded the corner near the string quartet's abandoned instruments. She grabbed a champagne bottle from a fallen tray and swung it hard into the back of his skull, the instant he raised his weapon, giving Damien's guards the half-second they needed to finish what she'd started. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes, though it felt like it stretched into something endless. Gunfire shattering glass, the guttural sounds of men falling, and guards shouting coordinates to each other across the wreckage of what had been. 20 minutes earlier, the most elegant room Rosie had ever stood in. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The last attacker went down under the combined weight of 3 guards near the grand staircase. Silence rushed in to fill the space gunfire had occupied, broken only by scattered sobbing and the low murmur of security confirming the room was clear. Vitale emerged from behind the bar, shaken but entirely unharmed, his sharp eyes finding Rosie across the wreckage with something that looked remarkably like awe. Damien turned to her, chest heaving, blood soaking through the shoulder of his cream jacket, where the graze had torn the fabric. His hands found her face, checking her over with a kind of frantic urgency he hadn't shown all evening. "You're hit," Rosie said, reaching for his shoulder. "I'm fine." His voice was rough, stripped of every ounce of practiced calm. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet meant for me. You'd have taken it in the chest instead of the shoulder," Rosie said simply, like it was obvious. "I did the math." Damien stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the alliance, nothing to do with Vitale, nothing to do with any of the reasons he'd hired her in the first place. He'd spent the whole night believing he was the one protecting her. He'd been wrong. Rosie Carter had just saved his life, and Damien Russo was only beginning to understand how much that changed everything. By midnight, the Russo estate had settled into the strange, adrenaline-soaked quiet that follows survival. Guards patrolled the perimeter in tighter formation. Staff moved through the wreckage of the ballroom, clearing shattered glass, and Vitale, visibly shaken but unharmed, had toasted Damien's security team with a brandy before retiring to the guest wing, more convinced than ever that the alliance was worth sealing. Everyone else was celebrating. Rosie wasn't. She sat on the edge of a chaise in the study, while a house physician bandaged a shallow cut on her arm, half listening to Victor recount the takedown to a small crowd of relieved guards. And something kept nagging at the back of her mind, small and persistent as a splinter. 4 attackers, all disguised as staff, all positioned with precision that meant they'd known the room's layout before they ever walked into it. That kind of knowledge didn't come from watching the estate from outside. It came from inside. She waited until the physician finished, then slipped out of the study while the house was still busy congratulating itself, and started walking the property the way she'd walked it every day for 2 years, except this time she wasn't dusting, she was looking. The East Wing security office was unlocked, which struck her immediately as wrong. Rosie had cleaned that hallway 100 times. That door was always locked, always guarded. Tonight, the guards stationed there had been reassigned an hour before the gala began, according to the shift log pinned to the wall. A change made so late it hadn't even been properly logged, just scrolled in different handwriting than the rest of the week's schedule. She checked the security monitors next. One camera, covering the East Service corridor, showed a clean, unbroken feed of an empty hallway. Too clean. No dust shifting in the light, no flicker, no movement at all in nearly 4 hours. Someone had looped the footage. Someone had disabled it deliberately, and done it well. In the corridor itself, she found what the camera had been hiding. A side table pushed 3 inches from where it always sat, faint indentations in the carpet where it usually stood and against the wall beside it. A fresh smudge of fingerprints on brass fixtures. No housekeeping staff had reason to touch that week. Only one person in this house had access to the security key, the shift schedules, and the camera systems without raising a single alarm. Marcus Bell, Damien's financial advisor of 9 years. A man Damien trusted enough to leave alone with account numbers worth more than small countries. Rosie found Damien in his study 20 minutes later, laying it out for him piece by piece, the missing key, the disabled camera, the moved furniture, the fingerprints, the shift change nobody remembered authorizing. Damien listened in silence, his expression darkening with every detail, until finally he stood so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. "Bring him here," he said to Victor. "Now." Marcus Bell arrived 15 minutes later, still in his tuxedo from the gala, his composure cracking the moment he saw Rosie standing beside Damien's desk. "Damien, whatever this is about, the security key," Damien said quietly, "went missing 3 days ago. Only 4 people have access to the master set. You're one of them. That's..." Marcus's eyes flicked to Rosie, then back. "That's circumstantial." "So is the camera you disabled at exactly the right window," Rosie said. "And the shift change you made an hour before the gala, and the furniture you moved to hide the fact you'd been in that corridor at all. You're careful, Marcus, just not careful enough." Marcus's jaw tightened, the mask slipping fast now. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. The Moretti family offered triple what Vitalia's alliance is worth. Triple, Damien. And you were going to hand this family's future to some old-world traditionalist because of pride. So you tried to have me killed at my own gala," Damien said, voice gone dangerously flat. "I tried to protect this family's future, the only way anyone was going to listen." Marcus's voice cracked with something between desperation and defiance. "You never would have listened otherwise." Damien said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded once to Victor, who stepped forward and removed Marcus's weapon before escorting him out under guard, his protests trailing off down the hallway until the house went quiet again. Damien exhaled, the weight of 9 years of misplaced trust settling heavy across his shoulders. He found what an entire security team missed. They were looking for someone who didn't belong, Rosie said. I've spent 2 years learning what belonging actually looks like in this house. It's easier to spot what's wrong when you know what's supposed to be right. Later, they stood together on the mansion's private balcony, the city glittering below them, the chaos of the evening finally settling into something quieter. Damien's shoulder was freshly bandaged beneath his shirt, and Rosie's arm still stung faintly where the bandage pulled at her skin, but neither of them mentioned it. I hired a wife for one night, Damien said finally, staring out at the skyline rather than at her, to close a deal. That was the whole plan. I remember, Rosie said softly. He turned to look at her then, something unguarded in his expression that she hadn't seen from him once in 2 years of scrubbing his floors. Somewhere along the way, he said, I forgot we were pretending. Rosie didn't have an answer ready for that. Not a clever one, not a deflection, nothing to hide behind, so she didn't try. Damien closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. When he kissed her, it wasn't rehearsed, wasn't coached, wasn't anything they'd practiced across a legal pad in his dining room. It was real and quiet and entirely their own. 3 months changed the Russo estate more than Damien would have believed possible. The guards still patrolled the grounds, and the business of the syndicate still moved through channels Rosie had learned not to ask too many questions about, but something underneath all of it had shifted. Staff who once flinched at the sound of Damien's footsteps now greeted him in the hallways without lowering their eyes. Victor ran meetings with fewer clenched jaws and more actual conversation. The fear that had once held the household together like a fist had loosened, slowly, into something that looked a great deal more like loyalty. Rosie noticed it in small things. The way the kitchen staff asked her opinion on menus instead of simply serving what they assumed the boss wanted. The way new hires were trained not just to obey, but to speak up when something seemed wrong. Because the last time someone had spoken up in this house, she'd saved it twice over. She'd stopped being the maid to most of the months ago. She wasn't entirely sure when she'd started being something else instead. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Damien found her in the East Wing, straightening a stack of linens out of habit more than necessity, and asked her to walk with him. He led her to the grand marble staircase in the main foyer, the same one where they'd stood the very first week, rehearsing a version of themselves that neither of them had believed in yet. The chandeliers above cast the same golden light they had that day, and for a moment Rosie could almost see the ghost of who they'd both been. Then, a maid with sharp instincts and nothing to lose, and a mafia boss who didn't yet know how badly he needed someone who refused to be afraid of him. Do you remember, Damien said, standing right here, telling me I was hiring an actress instead of a wife? I remember you looking like you wanted to fire me on the spot. I considered it. He almost smiled. For about 4 seconds. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, and Rosie felt the air in the foyer go very still. The contract ended long ago, Damien said, lowering himself to one knee on the same marble where they'd once practiced a lie. My heart didn't. Rosie's hand came up to her mouth, every clever, composed response she might have had dissolving somewhere in her chest. I hired you to save an alliance, Damien continued, voice steady despite the moment. You saved my life twice, exposed a traitor. My own security team missed, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, you taught me what actually holding this family together looks like. I don't want a fake wife anymore, Rosie. I want a real one. I want you. He opened the box. The ring inside was elegant, unmistakably real, chosen, she'd learn later, with the same careful attention he'd once given to memorizing fake anniversary stories. Yes, Rosie said, before he'd even finished asking. Then, steadier, but on one condition. Damien raised an eyebrow, still kneeling. Another negotiation. Always. She pulled him up by the hand, meeting him eye to eye the way she had from the very first day. I'll never stand behind you, Damien. Not at Galus. Not in business. Not in this family. If we're doing this, we do it as equals. We'll stand beside each other, Damien said, without hesitation, without a single second of the old resistance she remembered from their earliest arguments. Always. The wedding took place 2 months later, in the same magnificent ballroom where a disguised assassin had once nearly ended everything, reclaimed now, filled with white and gold instead of gunfire and broken glass. The The guests who had once whispered about Damien's unglamorous choice now rose to their feet in genuine applause as Rosie walked down the aisle in a gown that mirrored the one she'd worn the night she first stepped into that room as his fake wife. Except this time, there was nothing fake about the look on Damien's face. Alessandro Vitale sat in a place of honor near the front, beaming with the pride of a man watching an alliance he'd helped seal turn into something far more valuable than shipping contracts. Victor stood to give a toast, his voice catching slightly as he spoke. 2 years ago, I brought Damien a parade of women who couldn't survive one dinner in this house, he said, raising his glass. The woman who actually saved this family walked in carrying laundry. I don't think any of us deserved to be as wrong about her as we were, and I don't think this family would still be standing without her. When it was Damien's turn to speak, he took Rosie's hand in front of every guest who had once doubted her. I built an empire that feared me, he said. Rosie taught me that the strongest empire is the one built on trust. Rosie smiled, lacing her fingers through his. You gave me a title, she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. I gave you a future. Together, we'll make sure no one in this family ever has to choose fear over each other again. The applause that followed was nothing like the whispers that had greeted her the night she first walked into this room. As the evening wound down, Damien and Rosie descended the grand marble staircase together hand in hand, exactly where their story had begun. Except this time there was no fake marriage to rehearse. No billion-dollar deal riding on a performance, no lie standing between them. Just a mafia boss and the woman who had never once been afraid of him, walking down together, not as an empire and its subject, but as equal partners ready to lead whatever came next. Rosie never asked to be seen, she simply refused to disappear. And in a world built on fear, that quiet defiance became the one thing powerful enough to save an empire and the man who ran it. Theirs is a story about being underestimated and choosing to stand tall anyway. Which moment made you believe Damien had truly fallen for her and not just the version of her he'd hired? If this story moved you, leave a like to let us know. Share it with someone who loves a mafia romance where love has to earn its place. Subscribe for more original cinematic mafia romance stories full of unforgettable characters and endings that stay with you. Some crowns are never given. They're earned by the ones brave enough to walk in unafraid.